thank you, Zoe, for the introduction, and thank you for coming out tonight. The other thing I just wanted to share with you, this is a passion I have in terms of hiking and writing about it. My day job is with an organization called Maine Coast Heritage Trust, where it's a statewide land trust in the state of Maine that focuses on conserving the beautiful coast of Maine. I've been doing that for almost 20 years. So tonight, I'm going to share with you a lot of highlights from the recent book that came out in June. And we'll do a little tour of New England and learn some new hiking places, learn about some of the organizations behind the scenes that are making these places available to us. At the end, I'm happy to answer any questions. There'll be lots of photos of wildlife and things like that. So before we get started with the formal slide show, that cover shot there on the left may be familiar to a number of people. That's the ridge line on Franconia Ridge in New Hampshire. From the summit of Mount Lafayette. It's on the Appalachian Trail, perhaps the most scenic ridge line in New England, maybe the most scenic part of the Appalachian Trail. This was a glorious day in July, a good time to be on a hike like that. You do have to be careful weather-wise. People have gone up there and not made it down because weather can turn and can be really treacherous up there. This other picture here, there's an early morning fog on the trail, the MidState Trail as it rises up to Mount Watauga in north central Massachusetts. Really nice hike that goes to a open ledgy summit with views of Boston skyline, Mount Wachusett, and large parts of Massachusetts. So let's just head into the sort of big picture on the hikes in the book. So this is how I focus on things. I like to provide a lot of variety and flexible itineraries for the hikes in my book. For example, in covering an area like the White Mountains where there's a lot of hiking opportunities, there are hikes on the fairly easy side. This is a casual walk that goes to Pondicherry in northern New Hampshire. It goes along an old rail corridor because of this beautiful secluded pond. That's views of the Presidential Range. It's not uncommon to see moose and other wildlife here. So that's sort of on the lighter side. There's also multiple day backpacks, very few. This is Bond Cliff in the heart of the Pemigewasset Wilderness, 45,000 acre wilderness in the heart of the White Mountains. It's a 25-mile long loop. It takes about 3 days for most people to do something like that. Most of the hikes in the book, despite these two on these sort of extremes, are more in that sort of 4, 5 to 8 mile range. I like to pick hikes that are in that range. The other thing I like to do is provide a lot of variety in itineraries for particular hikes. So this hike here is a fairly new end-to-end trail in the Lakes region of New Hampshire. That's the Belknap Range Trail on ledges going up to the summit of Belknap Mountain. It's about a 14-mile trail from one end to the other end, which I describe in the book. If that's too long, not your cup of tea, the book provides information on how you can do shorter day hikes on either end of that, from either parking lot. A popular one on the eastern side is to go to Mount Major, which is a popular hike in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, provides tremendous views of Lake Winnipesaukee and the White Mountains. And on the other end, Mount Gunstock and Belknap, you can do a nice 5-6 mile loop on that end as well. One of the things I really like about hiking New England is a lot of history in New England. I try to capture that in the descriptions and on some of the hikes that I put in the book. So one place that's not too far from here is Battle Road, a really nice walk in Concord and Lexington. You can learn a little bit about the history of the country and the earliest battles between the Minutemen and the Redcoats. Really fun hike, but you learn a lot as well. A little bit more rustic hike would be the Horse Caves on Mount Norwottuck. This is in Amherst, Mass. In these caves in the late 18th century, Daniel Shays stored arms and munitions in here during the Shays Rebellion. That was a famous rebellion that helped lead to the downfall of the Articles of Confederation and what became the Constitution that we have today. So this is along the Monadnock Trail outside of Amherst. It's a really nice hike and it's really interesting going through these caves. In the state of Connecticut, there's another cave here. It's called Wolf Den. It's in a state park called Nipmuk State Park, and I think it's in Putnam, Connecticut, kind of eastern part of Connecticut. This is the site supposedly of where Israel Putnam shot the last known wolf in the state of Connecticut. I don't know if it's something to brag about or not, but that's where it happened. And later on, he went to gain some fame in the Battle of Bunker Hill. So this is, as a person, again, at the beginning of the country's formation. Nice 5-mile loop that goes to this den and other little nice natural features there. A little more recent history. This is Hublon Tower on the border of Simsbury and Bloomfield, Connecticut, near Hartford. This was built by a German immigrant around the early 1900s. And its sort of claim to fame is that prior to being elected president, Ronald Reagan spent the night here. He was head of the Screen Actors Guild at the time. And then as president, Dwight D. Eisenhower spent the night here. So this place, the owner of it lured some famous folks to spend the evening. Now it's owned and maintained by a nonprofit, and you want to time your hike to the summit based on when the tower is open. You can go in, do a little tour, and get up to the windows up on the top there, and you get an unbelievable view of the state of Connecticut. You're overlooking the Connecticut River Valley. You can see almost the entire state of Connecticut. I like to do a lot of bird watching and look for wildlife. And so one of the hikes that I picked in the book is Monhegan Island. This is off the mid-coast of Maine. It's about an hour-long passenger boat ride ferry. There's 3 different boats that take you there. There's information in the book on how to locate those places. But it drops you off right at the town dock. And so on the one part of the island, about 15-20% of it, there's a village with inns and restaurants and art galleries and things like that. And then about 80% of the island is conserved and has a nice network of trails. The most scenic trail is the shoreline trail that goes all around the entire shore of the island. It's about 5 miles from the dock around to the dock. And these cliffs are just spectacular, 160, 180 foot drops right into the ocean. If you happen to be there another 2 days, you really see the surf pounding against that, I'm sure, with the hurricane approaching. If this island is really popular for bird watching, particularly during spring migration, fall migration too, but the birds are more interesting to see in the spring. So some of the songbirds you may see a place like this, you have black and white warblers, chestnut-sided warblers, American redstart, northern parula, palm warbler, magnolia warbler, Blackburnian warbler, yellow rump warbler, common yellowthroat, black-throated green warbler, and a black-throated blue warbler. So there's 11 pictures up on that screen right now. If you hit it just right when they're during migration, it would not be unusual to see all 11 of these birds in town in mid to late May during migration. These birds you'll see scattered all around New England during nesting season as well. Again, earlier I mentioned that I work for a land conservation organization, so I like to promote as much as I can the organizations that are doing a lot, have done a lot, and are doing a lot to protect places that we're able to enjoy hiking throughout New England. Unlike western parts of the country, all of the Northeast was privately owned at one point. So all these public places that we have to explore today are all because of conservation organizations today and those that have come before us. So some of the examples that I focus on in the book, this is George Parker Woodland in Rhode Island. It's one of many Audubon Society properties in Rhode Island. And there are Audubons throughout all of New England. Those are great places. It's a great resource to look for hiking opportunities. That's my daughter hiking along a trail that the Berkshire Natural Resources Council maintains in a property they own in, I think it's in the town of Savoy. It overlooks North Adams, Massachusetts. It goes to the summit of Spruce Mountain, and with great views of Mount Greylock. And this hike in particular starts off really high on the Mohawk Trail, so it's a fairly gradual climb to get to a nice viewpoint. This picture here is in the mid-coast Maine. It's a place called the Georges Highland Path. In this area, the Georges River Land Trust and the Coastal Mountain Land Trust, 2 local land trusts in the state of Maine, have conserved a lot of land and pieced together this 10-mile trail that goes end to end over a number of scenic summits like this is Ragged Mountain. If you know Camden at all, this is the mountain where the Camden Snow Bowl is on. This picture here is of Mount Roberts, which is one of the nice mountains in the Lakes Conservation Trust property. It's about a 6,000 acre property around the Castle in the Clouds. So the Castle in the Clouds is sort of the 100-year-old plus tourist destination that people would come to rejuvenate and get closer to nature. In recent years, the Conservation Trust up there acquired that land. Now it's just an oasis of hiking trails. What's nice about the trails there is that when they inherited this land, there was a lot of old carriage paths. So a lot of hiking in New England, you get kind of these really steep hikes, and these carriage paths are really gradual. So the hikes here could be a little bit longer, but they're much easier on the legs. That's Lake Winnipesaukee there, looking south towards that belt knot range. I mentioned that trail earlier. This picture here is in northern Maine. It's a Nature Conservancy property in the Debskineg Lakes Wilderness, 45,000 plus or minus conservation area they have near the Penobscot River north of Millinocket. The Nature Conservancy, like Audubon, is another organization with chapters in every New England state, and they're a great resource to find places to hike and explore. We're also blessed with a lot of trail organizations that maintain the trails that we have come to love and enjoy. One of the more significant ones in Connecticut is the Connecticut Forest and Park Association. They maintain a network of 800 miles of what they call blue blaze trails in the state of Connecticut, across the entire state of Connecticut. Small ones like that one I mentioned at Wolf Den, that's one of the blue blaze trails. Again, it's like 4.5 mile loop. They have longer sort of end-to-end ones that are more like 20 or 30 miles and everything in between. So some of the ones I feature in the book, this is the Quinnipiac Trail that scales the rugged slopes of Sleeping Giant State Park. This is near Quinnipiac University, Hamden, Connecticut, not that far from New Haven. It's a pretty rugged trail. Again, like I said earlier on, I like to provide variety. So a lot of the people who hike to the summit of this mountain do what's called the Tower Trail. It's a much more groomed, gradual path that takes you to this CCC-built tower on the summit of the mountain. So you can get information if that's what you want to do, or you can explore this more rugged path and get off the beaten path a little bit. Another nice hike I like on the border of Connecticut and New York is Macedonia Brook State Park. So there's a loop that circles that entire state park. I think it's about 2,500 acre state park. A lot of it circles around Macedonia Brook. The high point on the trail is Cobble Mountain, where you have a nice open ledge. You're looking west towards the higher summits of the Catskills. A nice place to see for wildflowers and birds and wildlife is the Nipmuk Trail. And this hike here begins in Bigelow Hollow State Park and goes into Nipmuk State Forest and makes its way to the Massachusetts line and actually goes a little bit into Massachusetts, not far from Sturbridge, Mass. And this is Breakneck Pond. So the Nipmuk Trail parallels the eastern shore of the pond for close to 2 miles. And it's hard to see in the picture, but this is mountain laurel flowering over here. So I did this hike in mid to late June when it was flowering, and it was like a tunnel of mountain laurel for like a mile along the shoreline. It was just beautiful. Some other wildflowers you may see here, other parts of New England, that's Jack in the Pulpit, and that's what it would look like when it first pokes out of the ground in May, depending on where you are in New England. You saw it this time of the year, it would look like that. Green Mountain Club is another trail organization with a proud history. It started in the state of Vermont around 1910. It maintains over 500 miles of trails in the state of Vermont. And if you've hiked in Vermont, you've hiked on a trail that's been touched with the Green Mountain Club, I can almost guarantee you. This here is the summit of Mount Mansfield. It's the highest point in Vermont. It's about a 2 mile stretch of high elevation above tree line. Really fun hike to do. You want to get up there early in the morning if you want to avoid some of the crowd. Some people you drive up there and you can take a gondola up there. But other than that, it's you have it to yourself as hikers. Usually the Green Mountain Club has a person on the summit throughout the summer talking to visitors to make sure that they're staying on the trail and protecting a lot of the fragile alpine vegetation that grows up there. Some of the wildflowers you may see, these are from more northern New England. That's a painted trillium. It's a purple trillium. And that's what a purple trillium would look like this time of the year. These are really hardy plants. It's not unusual in the White Mountains to see a big patch of snow in this one little area where the sun's hitting, and you'll see these guys poking out of the ground. Of course, you can't mention trail organizations. I'll mention the Appalachian Mountain Club. They have a major presence throughout all of New England, probably with a minor exception of Vermont because of the Green Mountain Club primarily. Their biggest presence has been felt in the White Mountains. That's been where the organization really got a lot of its roots, although it's, has a long history in Mount Greylock and more recently in Maine as well. This is a picture from Lonesome Lake, which is close to their Lonesome Lake hut. So they own 8 huts in the White Mountains that are available for overnight reservation in advance. They're fairly rustic, but you can get well fed. They book up well in advance as well. So despite the name of this pond, Lonesome Lake, on a day like this, you will not be lonesome there, I can guarantee you that. The weather we've had recently, there's probably some days you can find that you'd be lonesome. But you can see why you would. I mean, it's just a $1 million view from here. So that's the picture of the Franconia Ridge. The cover shot I mentioned was taken from Mount Lafayette on the left there, looking to the south. This is the view of that ridge from the west. Birds you may see here would be a red-breasted nuthatch. And that's a cedar waxwing, which would be pretty common around the pond because they eat a lot of insects that you'd see circulating around the pond. So there's a lot of long-distance trails in New England. I didn't focus on describing all of them from end to end. What I tried to do is find particular hikes along certain portions of them, or one hike along a portion of it, as just to introduce you to a resource that you can just tap into and find more hiking opportunities. So in southern New England, there are a number of them. One was mentioned earlier, the Bay Circuit Trail over here. So that's a picture along the Bay Circuit Trail in Borderland State Park, which is fairly close by. The Bay Circuit Trail circles more than 200 miles, I believe, around, basically does a semicircle around Boston, largely paralleling 495 and 128. And it's just got unlimited hiking opportunities. It goes through numbers of state parks and private conservation areas and so forth, and just a great resource not that far from where you live. Another long-distance trail to explore in southern New England is the MidState Trail that travels 90 miles from the Rhode Island border at the northern terminus of the North-South Trail, which goes from northern Rhode Island to Charleston, which is on the Charleston Beach in Rhode Island. It goes 50 miles there. On the northern end of the MidState Trail, north of Mount Watatic, the trail connects with the Wapak Trail, which just goes 20 miles into the state of New Hampshire. So combined, those trails are 160, 170 miles long. This is balanced rock on Mount Wachusett. Mount Wachusett is probably the most prominent natural feature along the trail. It's a 2,006-foot summit, highest point in eastern Massachusetts. This rock was left there by the glaciers 10,000 plus years ago, whenever. It's a nice little hike to the summit. One of the things I like about Mount Wachusett, it's one of the few places in New England where you can do some hikes in some fairly old growth forest. There are trees on the slopes of Mount Wachusett that date hundreds of years, they're 100 years old. Another long distance trail, this is near the summit of Mount Tom and the Mount Tom Reservation in Northampton, Mass. East Hampton, one of those Hamptons. And that's on, 10 or 15 years ago was the Metacomet-Monadnock Trail that went from the New Hampshire border to Connecticut. Then it became the Metacomet Trail into Connecticut. And then there was what's called the Metabessa Trail in Connecticut. And those go from Long Island Sound now. They're all part of the New England Trail. They've all been merged into the New England Trail. And they go from Long Island Sound now all the way through Connecticut, all the way through central Massachusetts, all the way to the New Hampshire border. And then I think a trail continues to Mount Monadnock from there. This is one of the more scenic points on on the Massachusetts portion of the New England Trail. Again, this is one of these, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, like sleeping giants. This is a trap rock mountain, and what's typical of these, they're really rugged. They tend to be kind of flat on one side, kind of gradual slopes, and then they just drop straight off, which is what you see here. And this is a really good place to see hawks during hawk migration, which if we ever get some winds coming from the northwest, that may pick up again. This is the time of the year where the hawks should be flying through. So it's a really prominent place to be able to spot them. They'll follow the winds, coming up the thermals coming up the mountain. And Mount Tom Reservation is a fun place to explore. There's a lot of diversity of plants and wildlife, amphibians, and things like that. So it's well worth a trip out there. Some of the wildlife you may see throughout New England, but in a place like this, that's a ovenbird, which is, they're really vocal. You hear them a lot. Sometimes they're really hard to see. They blend in a lot with the colors. Unlike the other warblers I showed earlier that were more colorful. So they call them ovenbird because they build their nests on the ground like that. And supposedly that looks like a Dutch oven. I know hiking, I don't know oven making, so I'll take their word for it. And those put the eggs. There were 4 little eggs in that nest. I was doing a hike actually in Rhode Island when I stumbled upon this, just hiking along, and out of nowhere this bird just darted out of nowhere. So I froze. I was with my son and we stopped, and I wanted to be careful not to step on it. So I was looking around and I happened to just see that nest and took a couple pictures and got out of there. Another long distance trail to explore. This is in northern New Hampshire. So the northernmost county in New Hampshire is Coos County. And there's now a trail that goes from southern part of Coos County, which is the White Mountains, and goes through a number of places and makes its way to the border with Quebec near 4th Connecticut Lake, which is the headwaters of the Connecticut River. It starts right on the border with Quebec. This particular hike, sort of in the middle point of the Coos Trail, is called Table Rock, and it overlooks Dixville Notch and Dixville Notch State Park. And that viewpoint is as precipitous as it looks in this picture. And it pretty much, that's one of my brothers standing there, and it gets narrower and narrower as you behind him. But it's just this bird's eye view. It's just spectacular. The hike I do in the book loops around here. On both sides, there's a road that goes through the notch, and it does about a 5.5 mile loop on both sides of the notch and goes to a number of ledges. This is the most dramatic one, and a couple of waterfalls. It's a nice, quiet hike to do. So earlier I mentioned the mountain laurel. So this is kind of the northern New England version of what mountain laurel is. It's sort of the understory you'd see. That's a hobble bush. And that's what it would look like this time of the year. So unlike the laurel, these are deciduous, so those leaves will come off. They'll turn kind of a purplish color and fall off. I mentioned earlier the Green Mountain Club. So their pride and joy is the Long Trail. The Long Trail is the oldest long-distance trail in the country. It started right about the time the Green Mountain Club started in the early 19-teens. And this is the summit of Camel's Hump, which is probably the most scenic summit along the whole ridge line. It's about, the trail goes 272 miles. This is about mile 180, 190 from Massachusetts. And what I love about hiking on the Long Trail, so my son and I, he was in high school 6 years ago. I took a month off, and we did it in 27 days. And it was really fun doing it as an end-to-end. So I like being able to stand on a hike on a summit like Camel's Hump and then looking back, and I can see in this picture Mansfield and Mount Belvedere, and I think you can see Mount Jay, and so you can see where we had gone for the last 10 days. And then look, because we started on the Quebec border, and then looking south, you can kind of see what was in store over the next week. It was really, really interesting that way. You can see all the way down to Killington, I think. And then on the other side, you got Lake Champlain, which is huge, and then the Adirondacks towering on the other side, and you can see all of the White Mountains on the eastern horizon. So a bird you may see here is the hermit thrush. That's the state bird of Vermont. And that's what their nest looks like. They're fairly closely related to robins, so they're reminiscent of a robin egg. Of course, the most famous long-distance trail we have in New England is the Appalachian Trail. So the long trail, I said, came first. It inspired the Appalachian Trail, which came shortly thereafter. And for about 100 miles in the state of Vermont, the two of them coincide. This particular picture here is one of my favorite parts of the Appalachian Trail. It's from the Bigelow Range in northern Maine. That's my son hiking. That's Avery Peak heading over to West Peak, which is the high point of the Bigelow Range. Fairly close to Sugarloaf Ski Area, if you're familiar with that area. You're looking out at Flagstaff Lake, and on a clear day you can see Mount Katahdin. So if you're doing the AT, and you're going northbound, you can kind of see the end is near, probably 150 miles plus or minus. After doing 1,800 miles, they do it like that. Some birds you may see here, that's a blackback woodpecker, a northern species that likes spruce fir forest. And another one that likes that same type of forest, that's a spruce grouse, a little wild chicken. He's pretty tame. The ruffed grouse, sometimes the mother ruffed grouse can be less than tame, but this guy's pretty tame. The other highlights are in the book. Okay, so there are two presidential traverses that I do in the book. The more famous one that people talk about often is the one over the White Mountains presidential traverse. 19, 20 mile traverse, depending on which trail you come down. It goes over 8 or 9 summits. It's just tremendous. You want to pick the right weather to do it because you're exposed. Of the 19 miles, you're above tree line for 14 miles, 13 miles. You're pretty much above tree line. And it's just pretty rugged. And a lot of people do it in 3 days. So there are 2 AMC huts that you can use to break it up. There's the Madison Spring Hut, Lakes of the Clouds Hut. Some crazy people like me do it in a day sometimes. Got up at like 4:30 in the morning with my brothers, and we were done by, 8 o'clock or something. But it's a wonderful hike. We had decent weather. It was really fun to explore. Sort of the lesser known presidential traverse. Yes, there are presidential peaks in Vermont. They didn't get the top tier presidents. They got some of the lower tier ones. They did get Teddy Roosevelt, so that's good. So this is a picture of from Mount Roosevelt looking at Mount Wilson. And the 2 other summits in the Vermont presidential traverse are Mount Cleveland, the only president to win 2 non-consecutive terms, and Mount Grant, who helped win the Civil War, so I guess he wasn't too bad. They could have named it Fillmore and Taylor or something, I don't know. So that one is a loop, so it's about 13, 14 mile loop. Again, there's backpacking opportunities on that one, although you can do it as a long day hike. Much different experience. So this one, I said you're out in the open. The one in Vermont, it's mostly a forested hike, so it's, you'll see a lot fewer people, a lot better chance to see wildlife. It's just a nice quiet hike in the middle of the Breadloaf Wilderness, which is 20,000 acres. It's the largest wilderness in Vermont. And wildflowers you may see mostly on the New Hampshire presidential hike. That's rhodora. That is Labrador tea, and that's sheep laurel. And the 3 of them typically grow together. They're low shrubby things that grow in the alpine area, sometimes in wetlands. They grow together, but they don't flower together. So they flower in that order. The rhodora comes out May, Labrador tea in June, and then the sheep laurel in July. So a lot of waterfalls and cascades featured in the book. There are the towering falls of Stepstone Falls, the highest falls in the state of Rhode Island. Before I started writing hiking books, I had no idea that Rhode Island, that waterfall is in the 14,000 acre Acadia Wildlife Management Area of Rhode Island. I had no idea that Rhode Island had a conservation area that big. And on the other side of the border, it's on the border with Connecticut, there are state parks and state forests in Connecticut that are like 20,000 acres. So it's a pretty big block of largely undeveloped land, 30 minutes from Providence. That is Chapman Falls in Devil's Hop Yard State Park in Connecticut. It's in East Haddam, Connecticut, not far from the Connecticut River. That's on the 8 Mile River. That state park is a lovely place. It's got a whole network of interlocking loop trails. That's March Cataract on the slopes of Greylock. Mount Greylock is the highest point in Massachusetts, almost 1,000 feet higher than anything else in Massachusetts. And when you're hiking Greylock, it's the one hike in southern New England where you really feel like you're in northern New England. The vegetation has that same feel to it. It gets wet like the trails in the White Mountains and the Green Mountains. It's a fairly forested hike, but one of the things I like about Greylock are little cascades like this that are abundant on the lower slopes of the mountain. So it's a nice feature of Greylock. That is Lybrook Falls, a fairly large waterfall in southwestern Vermont near the town of Manchester. It's about a 4-mile round-trip hike to get to that waterfall. That's Arethusa Falls in Crawford Notch State Park in New Hampshire. That's the highest waterfall in New Hampshire. It's on a nice 4.5 mile loop with Frankenstein Cliff, or you can just go to the waterfall out and back. It's about 3-mile round trip. And I was talking to someone earlier about the AMC has about 75,000 acres in northern Maine that they acquired 15, 20 years ago. It abuts Gulf Haggis, which has been protected for a long time. It's a little side trail off of the Appalachian Trail. They call it the Grand Canyon of Maine. It's not the Grand Canyon. It's beautiful, but that's a stretch, I think. So that's Buttermilk Falls there. It's one of a dozen or so falls, some of them named, some of them not, that go, the Pleasant River sort of cuts through this slate canyon. Some areas are somewhat open like that. Sometimes it gets really narrow. There's a place called the Jaws. So it's kind of a rugged hike. You don't climb a lot, but there's a lot of little ups and downs. And it's all slate, which can be kind of slick. This year would be a tough year to do it with all the rain we've been getting. So more and more people are getting into winter hiking, which I really enjoy. You just have to be prepared with the right amount of gear. Excuse me. Obviously, the daylight is shorter, temperatures are colder, wind chill. And this was a day I did with my brother, Mount Jackson on the southern presidential range. I think it was a high temperature of maybe 10 that day, maybe 15. I don't remember. It was cold and windy. But as long as you have the layers to stay warm, make sure you have snowshoes, make sure you have micro spikes or something like that to grip on the ice. The positive of the winter that I really like, you don't get days like this in the summer. I mean, this picture, perfect blue sky here, you can just see for miles, everything's clear. When the light is low, the shadows you see in the mountains, it's so different. And then the other thing is, in the winter, sometimes it's more difficult going up than it is in the summertime, but it's almost always easier going down. So in the summer, you're worried about rocks and roots and wet rocks and wet roots. In the winter, this day there was so much snow, you just put it on cruise control. You just sort of hike down the mountain. And if you fall in a couple feet of snow and you get up. So a bird you may see there is a gray jay. They frequent a lot of popular places in the White Mountains. They actually will feed out of your hand sometimes. I'll sort of wrap up with a little tour of some popular destinations that you may want to explore in New England. So southern coastal New England, a couple of hikes I feature in the book. That's Great Island on Cape Cod National Seashore, really nice hike, the most rugged hike in the seashore. I really like it. It goes along the beach. It's a good place to see piping plovers and birds like that. And then it loops back around over the dunes and through some of the wetlands. You got to be careful about the tides here because some of the trail is submerged during high tide. And this is the Block Island. So Block Island off the coast of Rhode Island, not that far from the tip of Long Island. It's kind of popular for people, party goers and weddings and things like that. But 40% of the island has been conserved in one form or another. And there's a whole network of trails. I think it's 20 to 30 miles of trails now called part of the Block Island Greenway. And so it's just a lovely hike I describe in the book that ends up at the southern part of the island. You're standing atop this huge sandy bluff at the southern end of the island. If you want to go there when it's quieter, just go. Both of these places, I live in Maine. I would prefer to go to these places sort of before summer, after summer, maybe when it's kind of icy or muddy where I live. Be good places to explore then. Animal you may see, again, I told you some of the trail is submerged during high tides. There's a whole army of fiddler crabs that scurry around in the marshes there. You got to be careful you don't squish them as you're walking along. And then a lot of wading birds like snow egrets would be common in the marshes. On the coast here and in Rhode Island, you may see American oyster catchers. That's a oyster bed right there. And these are sanderlings, which are fun birds to watch along sandy beaches. I got a picture of this guy on the rocks, but a lot of times you see them on the sand. They feed right along as the waves are coming up and going down. You see these little bubbles coming out of the ground. They're picking out the little organisms that they're finding in there. Berkshire is another great place to visit. Western Connecticut, Western Massachusetts. This is a picture from the summit of Bear Mountain, which is the highest summit in Connecticut. The highest point in Connecticut is on nearby Frizzell Mountain, whose summit is in Massachusetts, but from a tenth of a mile down the ridge is a point that's higher than the summit of Bear Mountain. So Bear Mountain is really nice, and that's got a good view of Mount Race on the right and Mount Everett. Mount Race is also featured in the book. I think it's the most scenic part of the Appalachian Trail in Massachusetts. A ridge line of half a mile or so. It's wide open. It's really gorgeous. So this is a fun hike to do. Both Bear Mountain and Race are fun hikes. This is Monument Mountain, one of 100 or so trustees of reservation properties throughout Massachusetts. This is one of their more popular ones. It's in Great Barrington. And it's a fun little loop hike to do right off the main road. I think it's Route 7. So some animals you may see here. They have eastern towies or rufous-sided towie. Those guys, I'm guessing everyone in this room wouldn't mind seeing him. I'm not sure you'd all want to see this guy though. So there are rattlesnakes out in portions of the Berkshires. I found this guy near Mount Allender on the New York border. On the trail had kiosks. There was a sign saying you're entering rattlesnake country, and my daughter and I were like, "No, I can't see any rattlesnakes." They're there. Once I saw he was there, and I, assessed the situation, we kind of walked around and left him alone. This was with a telephoto lens. I'm not that close to him. Although close enough that shortly after that, the rattle went off, and my daughter screamed, and I was running right behind her. But really impressive animal. Once I got over the scare factor. So the Monadnock region, I've mentioned earlier, I've been hiking in New England for 5 decades. The first hike I did was Mount Monadnock. I was, I think 3.5 years old. I grew up in southern New Hampshire. That's not far from where I lived. And it's one of the most hiked mountains in the world. Now, Monadnock, the term Monadnock means mountain kind of by itself. That's what the Abenakis referred to Mount Monadnock. That was a name for Mount Monadnock. Now that term is used to describe any mountain like that geologically anywhere in the world. It's a geologic term now. And so there are a number of these Monadnocks in the Monadnock region, Monadnock being the most significant of them. And it's just a great hike, 3,165 feet, I believe. It's all, because of fire, it's all exposed granite on the summit. You could just, because it's all by itself, you could just see unobstructed views in all directions. Another Monadnock out there is Pack Monadnock. So this is a view from the Cliff Trail on North Pack Monadnock, looking at Mount Monadnock as the mountain on the horizon. On a clear day, you can see the Boston skyline from here and Mount Monadnock. And then I know some people are going to Cardigan this weekend. So that's the view of Mount Cardigan from the fire screw, which was the name given. There was a smoke created that shape. That's how I got the name. So we do a nice loop that starts from the Appalachian Mountain Club Lodge at the base of the mountain. AMC owns some land at the base, and then it abuts a state park at the summit. But again, just like Mount Monadnock, because of fires, it's got all this exposed granite. It's kind of by itself. You just get great unobstructed views of Vermont and the White Mountains. It's just a great hike. Okay, so we saw the rattlesnake before. You may want to worry about him. This guy I don't think you need to worry about. That's a red F, which is the juvenile form of the eastern newt. That's a spring peeper. He happened to fall by my side. I was hiking. He fell and grabbed a hold of this balsam fir limb. There are 2 tree frogs we have in New England, the gray tree frog and the spring peeper. He's smaller. The gray tree frog is gray. This guy's got a brownish color, and he's got that kind of X shape on the back. There's a toad sitting in a hole with a slug on his head. I always like watching toads, and they're probably maybe the most common animal you're going to see on hikes in New England. And then the most common reptile you're probably going to see, other than the garter snake maybe, is a painted turtle. They like to sun themselves. They're pretty obvious. Green Mountain National Forest, great destination in south and central Vermont, 450,000 acres, hiking opportunities throughout that area. This is one of the easier hikes. This goes to Little Rock Pond, about 4 mile round trip. You go to the pond, you can loop around the pond, head back. It's a nice place. You feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. You're not that far from civilization, but you feel like it. Again, like I said earlier, I'd like to provide variety. One of the options I do in this hike is describe an extension. You can go up over Green Mountain there and make your way back to the parking lot. Instead of 4.5 miles, it's more like 7-mile loop. You can get a little bit more of a workout, get some views from the top of the mountain. That's bunchberry and blue bead lily or clintonia. They often flower together, not always, but often. That's what the bunchberry looks like now, and the blue bead lily. So the White Mountain National Forest, probably the most significant hiking resource we have in New England. With the forest itself is over 800,000 acres, and then with state parks and other things, you're pushing almost 1 million acres of land with hiking trails for all levels of ability. All, whether you want a short hike, a half-day hike, full-day hike back, whatever you're looking for, you can find in the White Mountains. This particular hike on the Kancamagus Highway goes to the summit of Hedgehog Mountain. I like to highlight this hike because a lot of times people sort of just drive through the White Mountains and they see a sign and they just start going. They have no idea where it's going to. And some of the trails off the Kank, they go 4, 5, 6 miles, and you just get to a trailhead and you haven't gone any views or anything. But I like doing that sometimes, but at least I know where I'm going there when I do that. This particular hike is like 4.5 miles, and you get these just tremendous views. So instead of hiking the same length up to a wooded ridge on Passaconaway, which you're looking at there, do this nice loop and get views of Mount Passaconaway. The views of Passaconaway are better than the views from Passaconaway. Even though it's a 4,000-foot mountain, and everyone likes to do their 4,000-foot mountains. I've done them, but there's pluses and minuses to all of them. That's a white-throated sparrow and pink lady slipper. Okay, Acadia National Park, not too far from where I live, a couple-hour drive. Great hiking resource. A couple things I like to focus on in Acadia. If you go to Acadia National Park, they have this wonderful free Island Explorer shuttle service that'll take you from the Hulls Cove Visitor Center or the Village Green in Bar Harbor to most of the popular trailheads in the park. It's free. You don't have to mess around with driving, with traffic, finding a parking space. I highly recommend it. And every book that I've written that features Acadia, I always do at least one hike that basically does that. Starts at Hulls Cove Visitor Center, gets on a shuttle, takes you to a trailhead, you do a hike, end up at a different trailhead, take you back to where your car is. Just as an example, but it's almost unlimited, the opportunities to do basically any kind of loop you want to do in the park without coming back to the same trailhead. So I highly recommend that service. A few years ago, as was mentioned earlier, I wrote a book just on Acadia National Park. Now, a lot of Acadia books feature on each trail, and a lot of the hikes in Acadia could be a half-mile trail segment that gets you from point A to point B, and then you got to find another trail to get you to point C, and so forth. What I try to do in my book on Acadia was to focus on the trail heads and to piece together the various trail segments into logical loops often. Whenever I can, I always put loops in my book. It's more interesting than going out and back the same way. So that is the feature that I tried to incorporate into that book. Before I get to that, this is a view from Great Head looking across Sand Beach. The Beehive is kind of a popular hike to do with ladders and so forth. It's a good one to test yourself before you tackle the Precipice Trail if you don't like heights. if you kind of freak out on the beehive, you don't want any part of the Precipice Trail. That's the white-tailed deer, pretty tame in the park. Bald eagle. And these are some barred owlets. There's been a barred owl that's been nesting often near Sturdamont Spring, near the base of Door Mountain. I found these two 3 or 4 years ago when I was doing some research. They make this really cool sound. I thought it was somebody like a metal rake doing something, and I found these two guys sitting up in the tree. That's someone who's doing trail work. So the crown jewel of New England and a pride and joy for any Maine resident. So I said earlier, I'm a lifelong New England resident. I was born in Connecticut, grew up in New Hampshire, spent a few years in Vermont, lived in Maine for the better part of the last 2.5 decades. And across the board, people in Maine are just really proud of Baxter State Park. This was a park that was donated to the people of Maine by a former governor, Percival Baxter. 200,000 acres wilderness in northern Maine. Just has fabulous hiking opportunities. And most people go to that centerpiece, which is Mount Katahdin. Highly recommend you go there. One of the hardest day hikes you're going to do in New England, really rugged. Just be prepared. But you're not going to be alone either, which is fine. Just be prepared for that. But I'd like to talk about for people is how Baxter State Park has all these other trails that, a lot of people, they go to Baxter, they just go to Katahdin, and they just ignore all these other trails that are in the park. So this hike here this is my daughter and son hiking with me to the summit of Mount Oji, which just provides unbelievable views of Mount Katahdin, looking at Mount Coe here across the way. That's the Coe slide. And this is still a challenging hike, not as challenging as Katahdin. There are less challenging hikes, there are easier hikes. There's just a whole universe of opportunities in Baxter State Park to explore. So if you go to the park, take advantage of the other trails that are up there. And on those other trails, you're more apt to see something like this, or perhaps this guy, but probably more apt to see this guy. And I'm a proud Italian American, so I always have to have something Italian in my presentation. So grazie, buon viaggio. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I really appreciate your attention, and I hope you had a good time.